You'll probably just get her old costume jewelry, my daughter-in-law Melissa said, with that syrupy laugh of hers, the one that made my skin crawl every time I heard it echoing through what used to be my peaceful home. I mean, what else would an old woman like you need? She was standing in my kitchen, rifling through the cabinets like she owned the place, which apparently she thought she would soon enough. The thing about being 72 years old is that people assume you've lost your edge, that the decades have somehow dulled your ability to see through their transparent schemes and pathetic manipulations. They look at your gray hair and your sensible shoes and think you're just some doddering old fool who doesn't understand what's happening right in front of her face. What they don't understand is that those same decades have given you a clarity of vision they'll never possess, a kind of X-ray sight that cuts through all their carefully constructed lies and reveals the ugly truth underneath. I'd been living this ugly truth for the past 3 years, ever since my beloved Harold passed and left me in this enormous house that had been our sanctuary for 47 years of marriage. The house where we'd raised our only son Michael, where we'd hosted countless Christmas mornings and birthday parties and quiet Sunday dinners, where every room held memories so precious they felt like physical things I could reach out and touch. The house that was supposed to be my comfort in these final years, but had instead become the stage for the most elaborate performance of greed and manipulation I'd ever witnessed. It started innocently enough, as these things always do. Michael had been concerned about me living alone in such a large house, and when he suggested that he and Melissa and their 2 children move in to help take care of things, I thought it was a blessing. I thought it meant I wouldn't have to spend these twilight years in solitude, that I'd have the warmth of family around me, that I'd get to watch my grandchildren grow up in the same rooms where their father had taken his first steps. What a fool I was. Within 6 months, Melissa had systematically taken over every aspect of my home and my life. She'd rearranged my furniture to suit her tastes, relegating my antique pieces to the basement because they were too old-fashioned for the main living areas. She'd taken over my kitchen completely, claiming that my cooking was too heavy for their modern dietary preferences, and had essentially turned me into a stranger in my own home. She spoke to me with this condescending sweetness that made my teeth ache, always calling me Mom, in this sing-song voice, while treating me like I was a slightly senile child who needed constant supervision. But it was the way she talked about my mother-in-law's jewelry collection that really opened my eyes to who she truly was underneath all that fake concern and artificial affection. My Harold's mother, Elena Worthington Clark, had been what people politely called eccentric, and what others less diplomatically described as completely mad. She'd lived her entire life surrounded by beautiful things, art, antiques, jewelry that seemed to come from another era entirely. When Harold and I were first married, she'd shown me her collection with the kind of reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts. Drawer after drawer of pieces that seemed to tell stories of bygone eras, necklaces that looked like they belonged in museum display cases, rings that caught the light in ways that made you understand why ancient civilizations had worshipped precious stones. "These pieces have history, Margaret," Elena had told me in that precise, aristocratic voice of hers. "They've been collected over generations, each one chosen for its significance, its craftsmanship, its beauty. Someday, they'll be yours, and I trust you'll understand their true value." But Elena had always been secretive about the specifics of her collection, keeping the pieces in an old safety deposit box at a bank downtown and only bringing them out for special occasions. She'd wear a different stunning piece to every holiday gathering, every important family event, but she never talked about their origins or their worth in concrete terms. To most people, especially someone like Melissa with her shopping mall sensibilities and her obsession with flashy brand names, Elena's jewelry probably looked like nothing more than old-fashioned costume pieces from another era. "I mean, seriously," Melissa would say whenever we were going through old photo albums and came across pictures of Elena wearing her jewelry. "Who wears stuff like that anymore? It's so dated, so over the top. No one wants to walk around looking like they raided a Renaissance fair costume box." She'd make these comments in front of Michael too, and he'd just laugh along with her because that's what men do when they're trying to keep peace in their marriages. He'd learned to tune out the undercurrent of cruelty in his wife's voice, the way she managed to make everything sound like a joke, while actually delivering a series of small, precise wounds designed to make me understand my place in their hierarchy. The worst part was watching my grandchildren, sweet Emma, who was 8, and little David, who was 6, slowly absorbing their mother's attitude toward me. They'd started calling me Grandma Margaret instead of just Grandma, like I was some distant relative rather than their father's mother. They'd stopped talking when I walked into rooms, trained by their mother's example to see me as an intrusion rather than a cherished family member. But I endured it all because what choice did I have? I was an old woman living on a fixed income in a house that was too big for me to maintain alone. Michael was my only child, and these were my only grandchildren. If I wanted to be part of their lives, if I wanted any family at all in my remaining years, I had to accept the terms that Melissa had established for our coexistence, or so I thought, until Elena's lawyer called with news that would change everything. Elena had passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 97, and apparently she'd left very specific instructions about how her affairs were to be handled. The lawyer, a distinguished gentleman named Mr. Pemberton, who'd been handling Elena's legal matters for over 3 decades, asked if the family could gather for the reading of the will the following Thursday afternoon. There are some significant assets to be distributed, he said in that careful way that lawyers have when they're trying not to reveal too much over the phone, and Mrs. Worthington Clark was quite specific about who should receive what. When I told Michael and Melissa about the appointment, I could practically see the dollar signs lighting up in Melissa's eyes. She'd always resented the fact that Elena had never warmed up to her, had never included her in family traditions the way she'd included me when Harold and I were first married. Elena had been polite but distant with Melissa, treating her with the kind of formal courtesy you'd show to a stranger you had no particular desire to know better. "Well, finally," Melissa said, not even trying to hide her excitement. "I mean, it's sad that she's gone, of course, but that house of hers must be worth a fortune, and all those antiques. Michael, you're probably going to inherit everything as the only grandson, right?" Michael looked uncomfortable with his wife's obvious enthusiasm, but he didn't correct her assumptions. "I don't know, Mel. Grandmother was always pretty unpredictable. She might have left things to charities or museums or something." "But your family," Melissa insisted. "Blood relatives always come first in these situations. And honestly, it's about time. I mean, we've been taking care of your mother for years now, sacrificing our own comfort to make sure she's not alone in this big house. We deserve some compensation for all that effort, don't you think?" The casual way she talked about taking care of me, like I was some sort of burden they'd nobly shouldered, made something cold and hard settle in my chest like a stone. But I kept my mouth shut because I'd learned that protesting only made things worse, only gave Melissa more opportunities to explain to me how grateful I should be for their generosity in letting me stay in my own home. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of October day that makes you want to stay inside with a cup of tea and a good book. Mr. Pemberton's office was in one of those old downtown buildings with marble floors and wood-paneled walls that spoke of old money and established traditions. Elena would have appreciated the dignity of it, the way it suggested that serious matters were handled here with appropriate gravity and respect. Michael had taken time off, work for the occasion, and Melissa had arranged for a babysitter because she said the children were too young to understand the importance of what was happening. She'd dressed up for the occasion in a navy blue suit that she'd bought specifically for the reading, telling everyone who would listen that she wanted to show proper respect for the deceased, while clearly positioning herself as the soon-to-be wealthy widow by association. Mr. Pemberton was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer who'd spent 30 years managing the affairs of an eccentric millionaire, impeccably dressed, meticulously organized, and possessed of the kind of formal manners that made you straighten your posture just being in the same room with him. He offered us coffee and asked about our drive and made all the appropriate small talk while organizing his papers with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. "Before we begin," he said once we were all settled in the leather chairs arranged around his mahogany desk, "I want you to know that Mrs. Worthington Clark spent considerable time crafting these arrangements. She was very specific about her wishes, and she asked me to ensure that they were carried out exactly as she'd written them. She also asked me to remind you all that she loved her family very much, but that she believed in rewarding loyalty and wisdom rather than simply blood relations." Melissa shifted in her chair, and I could see her calculating what that might mean for her own prospects. She'd never been particularly nice to Elena, had never hidden her opinion that the old woman was out of touch with reality and living in the past. But she'd also never been openly rude, had always maintained a surface level of politeness that she probably thought counted as proper respect. "The house," Mr. Pemberton continued, consulting the documents before him, "along with all its contents, furnishings, and grounds, goes to Michael Worthington, with the stipulation that he may not sell or transfer the property for a period of 10 years. Melissa's face lit up like Christmas morning. I could practically see her mentally redecorating Elena's beautiful Victorian mansion, probably planning to gut all the historical details and turn it into some sort of modern showcase that would make the neighbors weep. Michael looked pleased but also a bit overwhelmed. The house was magnificent, but it was also a significant responsibility. The investment portfolio, Mr. Pemberton went on, valued at approximately $1.2 million, is to be divided equally between Michael and Margaret, with the funds to be managed by the firm that has been handling Mrs. Worthington Clark's accounts for the past 15 years. $600,000. I felt dizzy just thinking about it. That money would mean true independence for me, the ability to make my own choices about where and how I wanted to live out my remaining years. It would mean freedom from having to endure Melissa's condescending treatment just to have a roof over my head. And finally, Mr. Pemberton said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, we come to the jewelry collection. Melissa leaned forward in her chair, and I could see her barely contained excitement. She'd been coveting Elena's jewelry for years, had made countless comments about how someone should really do something with all those old pieces, and how it's such a waste to keep beautiful things locked away where no one can enjoy them. Mrs. Worthington Clark was very specific about this bequest, Mr. Pemberton continued. She wanted the jewelry collection to go to someone who would truly appreciate its value, both monetary and historical. Someone who understood the significance of the pieces and would care for them properly. Michael has always appreciated beautiful things, Rishaz, Melissa said quickly, shooting a sharp look at her husband. And I have experience with jewelry. I worked at Tiffany for 2 years before we were married. I know how to care for precious pieces properly. Mr. Pemberton looked at her over his reading glasses with the kind of expression that suggested he'd heard similar claims many times before and was not particularly impressed. I'm sure you do, Mrs. Worthington. However, Mrs. Worthington Clark's instructions were quite clear. The entire jewelry collection goes to Martha Worthington, along with all documentation regarding the piece's provenance and insurance valuations. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Melissa's mouth actually fell open, and for the first time in 3 years, she was completely speechless. Michael looked surprised, but not displeased. He'd never had much interest in jewelry anyway, and I think he was happy that his grandmother had remembered me so generously. That seems, Melissa started, then stopped, clearly struggling to find a way to express her outrage without appearing openly greedy. I mean, that's very generous, of course, but doesn't Michael, as the male heir, traditionally inherit valuable items like jewelry? For his wife to wear, I mean? Mr. Pemberton's expression didn't change, but I caught the slightest hint of distaste in his voice. Mrs. Worthington Clark was quite progressive in her views about women's independence, Mrs. Worthington. She believed that valuable assets should go to the people most likely to appreciate and preserve them. She spent many hours over the years discussing her collection with Margaret, and she was impressed by Margaret's knowledge and genuine appreciation for the piece's historical significance. But what could she possibly do with jewelry like that? Melissa asked, her voice rising slightly. I mean, no offense, Mom, but you're not exactly, well, you don't really have occasions to wear formal jewelry anymore, do you? Wouldn't it make more sense for the pieces to go to someone who could actually use them? There it was, the mask finally slipping. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law act was cracking, revealing the grasping, acquisitive person underneath who saw everything in terms of what she could get and use and show off to her friends. The value of the collection, Mr. Pemberton said, completely ignoring Melissa's increasingly desperate protests, has been appraised regularly over the years. Mrs. Worthington Clark was quite meticulous about documentation. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. The most recent appraisal, completed just 6 months ago, valued the collection at approximately $12 million. The silence this time was different, heavier, charged with an electricity that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Michael went pale. Melissa's face cycled through about 6 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Shock, disbelief, rage, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate, grasping hunger that was almost frightening to see. $12 million? Michael whispered. Dollars? Melissa added, her voice cracking slightly. Indeed, Mr. Pemberton said calmly. The collection includes several pieces of museum quality, including a necklace that once belonged to Marie Antoinette, a tiara that was commissioned by Russian nobility in the 18th century, and a brooch that was a gift from Napoleon to Josephine. Mrs. Worthington Clark's family had been collecting for over 2 centuries, and she continued that tradition throughout her life. I felt like I was floating outside my body, watching this scene unfold from somewhere near the ceiling. $12 million. I was now worth $12 million. More money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Enough money to buy my freedom from every indignity I'd suffered over the past 3 years. Enough money to live exactly as I chose for the rest of my days. But it was Melissa's reaction that really drove home the magnitude of what had just happened. She was staring at me like I'd personally reached into her purse and stolen her wallet. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the mottled red flush that was creeping up her neck, and her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "There must be some mistake," she said finally. "I mean, that's an enormous amount of money to leave to. I mean, Margaret is a lovely woman, of course, but she's elderly and she lives on a fixed income, and she doesn't really understand the value of— I mean, wouldn't it make more sense to leave something that valuable to someone who could properly manage it?" Mrs. Worthington Clark was 97 years old and in complete possession of her faculties, Mr. Pemberton said, with the kind of crisp authority that made it clear the discussion was over. She consulted with financial advisors, tax attorneys, and insurance specialists to ensure that her bequests were structured properly. Margaret will receive full ownership of the collection, along with all necessary documentation and insurance policies. He turned to me with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Mrs. Worthington Clark also asked me to tell you that she was grateful for the many hours you spent listening to her stories about the pieces, and that she knew you would understand their true significance." I thought about all those afternoons I'd spent with Elena, sitting in her sun-filled drawing room while she brought out one treasure after another and told me their histories. The emerald parure that had belonged to a French duchess who'd fled during the Revolution. The diamond bracelet that had been a wedding gift from a railroad baron to his young bride. The pearl earrings that had been worn to Queen Victoria's coronation. I'd listened because the stories fascinated me, because I could see how much joy it gave Elena to share these connections to history with someone who truly appreciated them. I'd never imagined that those conversations had been laying the groundwork for this moment, this incredible gift that would transform the rest of my life. The drive home was conducted in almost complete silence. Michael seemed lost in thought, probably trying to process the reality that he'd just inherited a house worth well over $1 million, and that his mother had just become wealthier than anyone in our family had ever dreamed of being. Melissa stared out the window with an expression like she'd been slapped, occasionally making small sounds of distress that she probably didn't realize she was making. It wasn't until we were back in my kitchen, I reminded myself, not theirs, that the full force of the situation hit me. I was rich. Genuinely, independently, impossibly rich. Rich enough to tell Melissa exactly what I thought of her condescending treatment and her transparent schemes. Rich enough to move out of this house that had become a prison and find somewhere I could live in peace. Rich enough to help my grandchildren with their educations without having to ask anyone's permission. Rich enough to live on my own terms for the first time in 3 years. "Soquette," Melissa said, her voice artificially bright in that way that meant she was about to say something particularly unpleasant. "I guess we need to figure out what you're going to do with all that jewelry. I mean, obviously you can't just keep $12 million worth of valuables sitting in a safety deposit box somewhere. That's not really practical for someone in your situation." "What situation is that?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear how she was going to phrase this. "Well, you know," she said, waving her hand vaguely, "you're getting older, and you don't really have experience managing large assets, and there are tax implications and insurance considerations and all sorts of complicated financial matters that someone with a more sophisticated understanding of these things should probably handle." I could see exactly where this was heading. Melissa was going to suggest that she and Michael should manage the collection for me, should handle all the complicated financial matters, while I continued to live as their dependent, grateful for whatever small allowances they chose to give me from my own wealth. "I think I can handle my own financial affairs," I said calmly. "Of course you can," Melissa said quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that these kinds of assets require special expertise, professional management, insurance specialists. It's a lot of responsibility for anyone, but especially for someone who's never dealt with anything like this before." Michael finally spoke up, though he looked uncomfortable. "Mom, maybe Melissa has a point. I mean, $12 million is a serious amount of money. Maybe we should at least help you find some professional advisors to help you figure out the best way to handle everything." "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but Mr. Pemberton already gave me the names of the specialists who've been managing Elena's affairs. I'm sure they'll be able to help me understand my options." Melissa's expression shifted slightly, and I could see her recalculating. If I had access to professional advisors who weren't under her influence, it would be much harder for her to manipulate me into making the decisions she wanted. "Well, of course that's an option," she said carefully. "But you have to remember that those people were working for Elena, not for you. They don't really know your situation or understand your needs. It might be better to find advisors who are specifically focused on helping you make the best decisions for your particular circumstances. My particular circumstances? You know, she said, and now I could hear the edge creeping into her voice, despite her efforts to sound concerned. You're 72 years old, and you live on a fixed income, and you've never had to manage significant wealth before. Those advisors are probably used to dealing with people who have sophisticated financial backgrounds and complex investment portfolios. They might recommend strategies that aren't really appropriate for someone in your position. There it was again, that constant reminder of my age, my supposed limitations, my need for their guidance and protection. For 3 years, I'd accepted these characterizations because I'd felt vulnerable and dependent. But sitting there in my kitchen, knowing that I had $12 million worth of jewelry in a safety deposit box downtown, those words hit me differently. Someone in my position, I repeated slowly. Well, yes, Melissa said, apparently not recognizing the dangerous tone in my voice. I mean, let's be realistic here. You're an elderly woman living on Social Security and Harold's pension. You've never owned stocks or bonds or real estate investments. You probably don't even really understand what $12 million means in practical terms. Michael shot his wife a warning look, but she was too caught up in her own momentum to notice. I think what you should do, she continued, is sell the collection and put the money into something safe and conservative, like CDs or government bonds. Something that will give you a steady income without any risk. And of course, since Michael and I have been taking care of your living expenses, it would make sense for us to continue managing your financial affairs to make sure everything is handled properly. The beautiful thing about being 72 years old is that you've reached the point in life where you don't have to pretend to be polite to people who are trying to rob you. You don't have to smile and nod and go along with their schemes because you're afraid of being alone. You don't have to accept being treated like a child by people who have never shown you genuine respect or affection. Melissa, I said, my voice perfectly calm and measured, in the 3 years you've been living in my house, you have never once shown me genuine kindness or respect. You've treated me like an inconvenient servant who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you chose to throw my way. You've taken over my home, dismissed my opinions, and made it clear that you see me as nothing more than a burden you're nobly shouldering until I have the courtesy to die and get out of your way. The color drained from her face, but I wasn't finished. You've trained your children to see me as a stranger rather than their grandmother. You've undermined my relationship with my own son by constantly reinforcing the idea that I'm too old and incompetent to manage my own affairs. And now, in the space of 2 hours since learning that I've inherited something of value, you're already scheming about how to get control of it. Mom, Michael said uncomfortably, I think maybe. No, Michael, I said, holding up my hand. I've been quiet for 3 years, while your wife has systematically dismantled my dignity and my place in this family. I think I've earned the right to speak my mind now. I turned back to Melissa, who was looking genuinely frightened for the first time since I'd known her. You want to know what my particular circumstances are? My particular circumstances are that I'm a 72-year-old woman who just inherited $12 million and no longer has to tolerate being treated with contempt in her own home. I never, Melissa started. You never what? I interrupted. You never called my cooking too heavy and banned me from my own kitchen? You never rearranged my furniture and put my things in the basement because they were too old-fashioned? You never rolled your eyes when I tried to join conversations? You never made jokes about my costume jewelry and my outdated clothes and my old-fashioned opinions? Each accusation hit her like a physical blow, and I could see her struggling to find a way to deny what we both knew was true. Those weren't... I was just trying to help you modernize a little bit, she said weakly. I thought you might enjoy having some fresh perspectives around here. Fresh perspectives, I repeated. Is that what you call it when you tell your children that Grandma Margaret doesn't understand how things work anymore? Is that what you call it when you have your friends over and introduce me as Michael's mother who lives with us, instead of as the woman whose house you're living in? Mom, please, Michael said, looking increasingly distressed. I had no idea you felt this way. Why didn't you say something before? Because, I said, suddenly feeling very tired. I was afraid that if I complained, you'd decide I was too difficult to live with and I'd end up alone. I thought having family around, even family that didn't particularly like me, was better than having no family at all. The silence that followed was heavy with 3 years' worth of unspoken resentments and carefully suppressed truths. Michael looked genuinely shocked, like he was seeing his wife's behavior toward me clearly for the first time. Melissa looked like she was trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that had spiraled completely out of her control. But now, I continued, standing up from my chair with more energy than I'd felt in years, I don't have to be afraid of being alone. I can afford to live anywhere I want, however I want, with or without people who actually care about me. And that, Melissa, changes everything. The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and arrangements that felt like emerging from a long, suffocating dream into brilliant sunshine. Mr. Pemberton introduced me to Elena's financial advisor, a sharp woman named Patty Hernandez who specialized in managing high-value collections and alternative investments. Patricia spent an entire afternoon explaining my options, from keeping the collection intact as a hedge against inflation to gradually selling pieces through auction houses to diversify into other investments. The beautiful thing about this collection, Patricia explained, is that it's not just valuable, it's historically significant. Pieces like these tend to appreciate faster than traditional investments because there's a finite supply of genuine antique jewelry and the demand from collectors and museums keeps growing. She also introduced me to an insurance specialist who explained how the collection was currently covered under Elena's policies and helped me transfer everything to new policies in my name. The premiums alone were more than my old annual income, but they represented a tiny fraction of the collection's value. Most importantly, Patricia helped me understand that I wasn't just wealthy. I was wealthy in a way that gave me genuine independence and choices I'd never dreamed of having. With proper management, she said, you could live very comfortably on just the insurance dividends and appreciation without ever selling a single piece. Or you could sell a few items and buy yourself a lovely house wherever you want to live. Or you could donate pieces to museums and take the tax benefits. The point is, you have options now, real options. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in my house had shifted dramatically. Melissa was walking around like someone who'd been diagnosed with a terminal illness, occasionally attempting to restart her campaign to convince me that I needed her guidance to manage my new wealth, but without her previous confidence or authority. She'd catch herself mid-sentence when she started to criticize something I was doing, apparently finally recognizing that her position in our household had fundamentally changed. Michael was struggling with what he'd learned about his wife's treatment of me, and several times I caught him looking at Melissa with an expression I'd never seen before, a kind of disappointed realization that the woman he'd married might not be the person he'd thought she was. The children sensed the change in dynamics even if they didn't understand what was happening. Emma asked me one evening why Mommy seemed sad all the time, and David wanted to know if I was moving away because he'd heard his parents arguing about houses and money late at night. I don't know yet, sweetheart, I told him honestly. But whatever happens, I'll always be your grandmother, and I'll always love you very much. The truth was, I was seriously considering moving away. Patricia had shown me some beautiful properties, a charming condo in a retirement community in Florida, a cottage near my sister in North Carolina, even a small apartment in Paris where I could spend my remaining years surrounded by art and history and people who didn't know anything about my past, except what I chose to tell them. For the first time in decades, my future felt like something I could shape according to my own desires, rather than something that was happening to me whether I liked it or not. The conversation I'd been dreading came on a Tuesday evening in late November. Melissa asked if she could speak with me privately, and I found her waiting in the living room with an expression of carefully rehearsed humility that immediately put me on guard. "Margaret," she began, and I noticed that she'd dropped the fake "mom" that had grated on my nerves for 3 years. "I owe you an apology. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I realized that I haven't always been as considerate as I should have been." I waited, saying nothing, while she struggled to find words that would somehow undo 3 years of casual cruelty and condescension. "I think maybe I got caught up in trying to help you adjust to getting older, and I didn't realize that some of my suggestions might have come across as criticism or control." "Suggestions," I said. "Yes, well, I can see now that maybe I was overstepping boundaries, and I want to make things right between us, especially now that now that your circumstances have changed." There it was, the real reason for this conversation. Not genuine remorse for how she'd treated me, but fear about how my changed circumstances might affect her comfortable life in my house. "What are you asking me, Melissa?" "I guess I'm asking if we can start over, if we can find a way to live together as a real family, with mutual respect and appreciation for each other." She paused, and I could see her gathering courage for what came next. "And I'm hoping that you'll consider letting Michael and me help you figure out the best way to handle your inheritance. Not because we want to control it, but because we care about you and want to make sure you make decisions that will give you security and happiness for the rest of your life. I studied her face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding, but all I could see was calculation. She was sorry that her previous strategy had backfired, sorry that she'd shown her true colors before securing control of my assets, but she wasn't sorry for the years of small humiliations and systematic undermining of my dignity. No, I said simply. No. No, we can't start over. No, you can't help me manage my inheritance. And no, I don't believe for a minute that this conversation is motivated by care for my well-being. Her carefully constructed mask of humility slipped slightly. I don't understand what you want from me. I'm trying to apologize. I'm trying to make things right. What I want, I said, is for you to stop pretending that 3 years of contempt and manipulation can be erased with one conversation now that you've realized I have something you want. That's not fair, she said, her voice rising. I know I wasn't perfect, but I was trying to help. You were struggling with Harold's death and you seemed lost and confused, and you thought I was a weak old woman you could push around until I died and left everything to Michael, I finished for her. And you were angry that I was taking up space in what you'd decided should be your house. This is your house, she said quickly. I never meant to make you feel otherwise. Melissa, I said, standing up to end the conversation, the time for this discussion was 3 years ago, when you first moved in and started treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own home. The time for respect and consideration was when I was grieving and vulnerable and needed family support, not when I became wealthy enough to command it. So what are you saying? She asked, and now I could hear the panic creeping into her voice. Are you throwing us out? Are you going to make your son and grandchildren homeless because you're angry with me? I'm saying, I replied calmly, that I'm going to make decisions about my life based on what makes me happy and peaceful, not based on what's convenient for people who have never shown me genuine kindness. The truth was, I'd already made my decision. 2 days later, I called Patricia and told her I wanted to move forward with purchasing the cottage in North Carolina. It was a beautiful little place on 2 acres, with a garden and a view of the mountains, and enough space for my books and my few pieces of furniture that had survived Melissa's redecorating campaign. More importantly, it was close to my sister Ruth, who had been widowed the year before and was facing many of the same challenges I'd been struggling with. We could look out for each other without either of us having to sacrifice our independence or dignity. I also decided to sell 3 pieces from the collection: a diamond bracelet, a sapphire brooch, and a ruby ring that Patricia said would bring about $2 million at auction. That money would buy my cottage, set up a comfortable living allowance, and leave me plenty for travel and whatever other adventures I wanted to pursue in my remaining years. When I told Michael about my plans, he looked sad, but not surprised. I understand why you need to leave, he said quietly. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was happening. I love Melissa, but I can't deny anymore that she treated you badly. What happens between you and your wife is your business, I told him. But I want you to know that you'll always be welcome to visit me, and the children can spend summers with me if they want to. This isn't about punishing you, Michael. It's about choosing to live somewhere I can be happy. He nodded, and I could see him struggling with emotions he didn't quite know how to express. Will you be okay? Living alone again, I mean? Michael, I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand, I've been alone for 3 years already, even with all of you living here. The difference is that now I get to choose my solitude instead of having it imposed on me. The moving day arrived in early January, crisp and bright and full of the kind of promise that makes you believe in new beginnings. I'd hired professional movers to handle the few things I was taking with me, mostly books, some photographs, and the pieces of furniture that had belonged to Harold and me before Melissa's redecorating campaign had banished them to the basement. Melissa had made herself scarce that morning, claiming she had errands to run, but I suspected she couldn't bear to watch me leave with my newfound independence intact. She'd made one last attempt the night before to convince me that I was making a mistake, that I'd be lonely and vulnerable living so far from family, but her heart wasn't really in it anymore. She'd realized that her window of opportunity had closed, and now she was just trying to salvage what she could from the wreckage of her plans. The children were confused and tearful, not really understanding why Grandma Margaret was moving away when they'd just gotten used to having her around all the time. I promised them that my new house had a big yard where they could play when they came to visit, and that I'd send them postcards from all the places I planned to travel to with my newfound freedom. Will you send us pictures of the pretty jewelry? Emma asked, and I realized that she was the only one who'd ever shown genuine interest in Elena's collection, always asking to see the photographs Mr. Pemberton had given me of the most spectacular pieces. "I'll do better than that," I promised. "When you're older, if you're still interested, I'll teach you about the history of each piece. Your great-great-grandmother Elena would have loved that." As the moving truck pulled away from the house that had been my home for nearly 50 years, I felt a complicated mixture of sadness and relief. I was leaving behind decades of memories, both beautiful and painful, but I was also leaving behind the version of myself that had accepted being diminished and dismissed by people who should have cherished me. The cottage in North Carolina was everything Patricia had promised and more. Nestled in a valley between gentle mountains, it sat on 2 acres of land that had been carefully landscaped with native plants and walking paths that meandered through groves of dogwood and mountain laurel. The house itself was small but perfectly designed, with large windows that brought the outside in and a stone fireplace that made the living room feel cozy, even on the coldest winter days. Ruth lived just 10 minutes away, and within a week of my arrival, we'd fallen into a comfortable routine of daily walks and shared dinners and long conversations about books and politics and all the things we'd never had time to discuss properly when we were younger and busier with our families and obligations. "You look different," she told me one evening as we sat on my porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Lighter somehow, like you've been carrying a heavy weight and finally got to put it down." She was right. For the first time in years, I woke up each morning without that familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach, without the constant awareness that I needed to be careful not to say or do anything that might irritate the people I depended on for shelter and basic kindness. I could cook what I wanted to eat, arrange my furniture however I pleased, play my music as loud as I wanted, and go to bed at whatever time felt right without worrying about disturbing anyone or being criticized for my choices. But the real transformation came when I finally went to see Elena's jewelry collection in person. Mr. Pemberton had arranged for me to visit the bank vault where the pieces were stored, and Patricia had come with me to help document everything for insurance purposes. I'd seen photographs of some of the items, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of being in that climate-controlled room surrounded by centuries of accumulated beauty and craftsmanship. The Marie Antoinette necklace was breathtaking, dozens of perfectly matched diamonds arranged in cascading loops that caught the light like captured starlight. The Russian tiara was a marvel of delicate metalwork, each curve and flourish representing hours of painstaking labor by master craftsmen who'd understood that they were creating something meant to last for generations. The Napoleon brooch was smaller than I'd expected, but no less magnificent, its emeralds and pearls arranged in a pattern that managed to be both imperial and feminine. But it was the simpler pieces that moved me most. A pair of Victorian earrings that Elena had worn to my wedding, a cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, a string of pearls that seemed to glow with their own inner light. These weren't just valuable objects. They were tangible connections to women who'd lived and loved and struggled and triumphed across 2 centuries of history. Elena was right, I told Patricia as we carefully documented each piece. These aren't just jewelry, they're stories. "And now they're your stories," she replied. "What do you want to do with them?" I'd been thinking about that question for months, and standing there surrounded by all that beauty and history, the answer finally became clear. "I want to share them," I said. "Not by selling them, but by making sure people can see them and learn their stories." Over the next several months, Patricia helped me explore the possibility of creating a traveling exhibition of the collection. It turned out that several museums were intensely interested in displaying pieces of such historical significance, and the insurance company was delighted by the idea because public exhibition would actually reduce the risk of theft compared to private storage. The first exhibition opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and I flew up for the opening reception feeling more nervous than I had since my high school graduation. But standing in that elegant gallery, watching people marvel at the same pieces that had captivated me during my afternoons with Elena, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. "These belong to your family?" asked a young woman who'd been studying the Marie Antoinette necklace with obvious fascination. "To my late mother-in-law," I explained. "She collected them over many decades, and she left them to me with the hope that they'd be preserved and appreciated." "They're incredible," she said. "I can't imagine owning something so beautiful and historically significant." "The wonderful thing about beauty," I told her, "is that it doesn't really belong to anyone. We're just temporary caretakers, responsible for preserving it for the next generation." Michael and the children came to visit for the exhibition's opening weekend, and I was pleased to see that he seemed genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished. Emma was completely enchanted by the jewelry, asking dozens of questions about each piece's history, and begging to hear the stories Elena had told me about their previous owners. Even Melissa had come, though she spent most of the reception looking uncomfortable and out of place among the museum donors and art historians who'd gathered to celebrate the collection. She made a few stilted attempts at conversation, trying to position herself as someone who'd always recognized the collection's value, but her heart clearly wasn't in it. "This is all very impressive," she said to me at one point, her voice carrying that familiar undercurrent of resentment that she couldn't quite suppress. "I suppose you're happy with how everything turned out." "I am," I said simply. "Are you?" She looked surprised by the question, like she'd expected me to gloat or make some pointed comment about justice being served. But the truth was, I didn't feel angry with her anymore. Anger requires a certain amount of emotional investment, and I'd moved beyond caring enough about Melissa's opinions to waste energy on resentment. "Things have been challenging," she admitted. "Michael has been different since you left, more critical, I guess. He notices things he never paid attention to before." I could have pointed out that maybe those were things he should have been paying attention to all along, but there didn't seem to be any point in saying it. Melissa was facing the consequences of her own choices, and those consequences had nothing to do with me anymore. "I hope you figure out how to be happy," I told her, and I meant it. Not because I'd forgiven her treatment of me, but because life is too short to waste on hoping for other people's misery, even when they've earned it. The exhibition toured for 2 years, visiting museums in major cities across the country, and even traveling to Europe, where some of the pieces were displayed in the palaces where they'd originally been worn. I attended as many openings as I could, always amazed by people's reactions to the collection and the stories behind each piece. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the exhibition's final stop at a small museum in Virginia that specialized in decorative arts. A group of elementary school children was touring the exhibition, and their teacher was explaining how jewelry had been used throughout history to show wealth and status and artistic achievement. One little girl, probably about 8 years old, raised her hand and asked, "Who decides what happens to beautiful things when the people who own them die?" "That's a very good question," the teacher said. "Usually families decide together, or sometimes people write instructions about what they want to happen to their valuable possessions." "But what if they don't have families?" the girl persisted. "What if there's nobody to take care of the beautiful things?" "Then museums or other institutions might take care of them," the teacher explained, "to make sure they're preserved for future generations to enjoy." The little girl nodded seriously, then asked one more question that took my breath away. "Do you think the people who own these things would be happy that we get to see them now?" Standing there in that quiet museum gallery, surrounded by the treasures that Elena had spent a lifetime collecting and preserving, I felt her presence so strongly it was almost like she was standing beside me. I thought about all the hours we'd spent together, all the stories she'd shared, all the care she'd taken to document each piece's history and significance. "Yes," I said quietly, speaking to the little girl, but also to Elena's memory. "I think they would be very happy indeed." When the exhibition finally ended and the pieces were returned to their secure storage, I found myself facing a question I'd been avoiding for months. What did I want to do with the rest of my life? I was 75 years old, in good health, and wealthy enough to do essentially anything I wanted. I could travel the world, buy a dozen houses, start a foundation, go back to school, learn new languages, take up painting, or simply spend my remaining years reading books in my garden and watching the seasons change in the mountains. The answer, when it came to me, was both simple and surprising. I wanted to help other women in situations similar to what mine had been. Patricia helped me establish the Elena Worthington Clark Foundation, dedicated to providing legal and financial assistance to older women facing family exploitation or financial abuse. We started small, with a legal aid clinic that offered free consultations to women who needed help understanding their rights and options when dealing with manipulative family members or unscrupulous caregivers. The stories I heard in those early months were heartbreakingly familiar. Women who'd been convinced by adult children that they were too old or confused to manage their own affairs. Widows who'd been systematically isolated from friends and support networks by family members who wanted control over their assets. Elderly mothers who'd been made to feel like burdens rather than cherished family members. But unlike my situation, most of these women didn't have $12 million worth of jewelry to transform their circumstances. They needed practical help, legal representation, financial planning assistance, sometimes just someone to explain their rights and help them understand that they didn't have to accept being treated with contempt by people who were supposed to love them. The foundation grew quickly, funded by the gradual sale of a few pieces from Elena's collection and supported by volunteers who shared my passion for elder advocacy. We opened offices in 3 states, trained dozens of legal aid attorneys in elder law issues, and helped hundreds of women reclaim their independence and dignity. The work was demanding but profoundly satisfying in a way I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I was using my resources and my hard-earned wisdom to make a real difference in other people's lives. I was taking the lessons I'd learned from my own experience and transforming them into something that could help others avoid or escape similar situations. Emma, now 11 and fascinated by everything related to justice and fairness, often asked me about the Foundation's work when she came to visit during school vacations. She'd inherited Elena's love of beautiful things, but had also developed a fierce sense of right and wrong that reminded me of myself at her age. "Grandma Margaret," she said during one visit, "why do people think it's okay to be mean to old people? Don't they know that they're going to be old someday too?" I think, I told her, that some people are so focused on what they want right now that they forget to think about how their actions affect other people. And sometimes people mistake kindness for weakness or age for incompetence. "But you're not incompetent," she said indignantly. "You run a whole foundation and help people and travel all over the place. You're probably smarter than most of the people who are mean to you." "Intelligence and competence aren't really the issue," I explained. "It's about respect and kindness and recognizing that every person has value regardless of their age or circumstances." She thought about that for a moment, then asked, "Do you think Mommy understands that now?" It was a complicated question with a complicated answer. Melissa and Michael were still living in my old house, but their marriage had been strained by the revelations about how she'd treated me. Michael had insisted on counseling, and from what I'd heard through Ruth, who maintained a careful correspondence with her nephew, they were slowly working through their issues. Melissa had never apologized directly to me, but she'd made efforts to improve her relationships with other family members, particularly Michael's elderly aunts, who had previously complained about her dismissive attitude toward older relatives. Whether this represented genuine growth or strategic adjustment, I couldn't say, but the important thing was that other people were being treated better as a result. "I think your mommy is learning," I told Emma carefully. "Sometimes it takes people a while to understand things that seem obvious to the rest of us. Like how you should be nice to people because it's the right thing to do, not because they have money." Exactly like that. As my 80th birthday approached, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory my life had taken since that afternoon in Mr. Pemberton's office when I'd learned about Elena's gift. The woman who'd sat in that leather chair, accepting Melissa's condescending comments and expecting to inherit a few pieces of old costume jewelry, had been transformed into someone I barely recognized, confident, independent, purposeful, and genuinely happy for the first time in decades. The foundation was thriving, with offices in 6 states and a growing network of partner organizations. The jewelry collection had become a permanent exhibit at the Smithsonian, with a portion of the proceeds from admission fees supporting elder advocacy programs. My cottage had become a gathering place for a circle of friends who shared my interests in history, literature, and social justice. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, to set boundaries with people who don't treat you well, and to build a life that reflects your values rather than other people's expectations. Ruth and I were sitting on my porch one evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains and discussing our plans for a trip to Europe the following spring, when she asked me a question that made me pause. "Do you ever regret how things worked out with Michael and Melissa? Do you ever wish you had found a way to make things work so you could have stayed close to your grandchildren?" I thought about it for a long moment, watching the sky fade from gold to purple to deep blue, studded with the first evening stars. "I regret that it took me so long to stand up for myself," I said finally. "I regret that I wasted 3 years accepting treatment that I should have challenged from the very beginning. But I don't regret leaving, and I don't regret choosing my own happiness over their convenience." "And the children?" "Emma and David know they're loved, and they know where to find me. They spend part of every summer here, and we talk on the phone every week. The quality of our relationship now is better than it ever was when I was living in the same house, but being treated like an unwelcome guest." "Do you think Elena knew?" Ruth asked. "When she left you the jewelry, do you think she understood what it would mean for your life?" I smiled, thinking about all those afternoons I'd spent listening to Elena's stories, the way she'd looked at me when she talked about the importance of preserving beautiful things for people who would truly appreciate them. "I think Elena understood exactly what she was doing, Ian," I said. I think she saw that I was trapped and gave me the key to my own freedom. The foundation continued to grow and evolve, taking on increasingly complex cases and developing innovative programs to address the various forms of elder exploitation we encountered. We created educational materials for families about how to discuss aging and care needs without undermining older relatives' autonomy. We developed training programs for financial institutions to help them recognize signs of elder financial abuse. We partnered with law schools to provide students with real-world experience in elder law while providing free legal services to women who couldn't afford private attorneys. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of the work was the individual relationships I formed with the women we helped. There was Dorothy, a retired teacher whose son had convinced her to sign over power of attorney and then systematically drained her savings account. There was Maria, whose daughter-in-law had moved into her house and gradually taken over every aspect of her daily life while treating her like an unpaid servant. There was Patricia, whose adult children had been pressuring her to sell her house and move into assisted living so they could divide the proceeds among themselves. Each of these women had a different story, but they all shared the same core experience of being diminished and dismissed by people who were supposed to love and protect them, and each of them, with the right support and resources, was able to reclaim their independence and dignity. The work was sometimes heartbreaking. Not every case had a happy ending, and sometimes women were too isolated or too psychologically beaten down to accept help. But even in those difficult situations, I felt like we were making a difference just by offering an alternative, just by showing women that they had options beyond accepting whatever treatment their families chose to give them. On my 82nd birthday, the foundation organized a celebration that brought together staff, volunteers, and many of the women we'd helped over the years. It was held in the ballroom of an elegant hotel, and as I looked around at all the faces, some familiar, some new, all representing stories of resilience and transformation, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path my life had taken. Emma, now 13 and increasingly interested in the foundation's work, had written a speech for the occasion that brought tears to my eyes. My grandmother, she said, standing at the podium with a poise that reminded me of Elena, taught me that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and it's never too early to start treating people with respect. She showed me that true wealth isn't about how much money you have, but about how much good you can do with whatever resources you've been given. She paused, looking directly at me with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and determination. Most importantly, she taught me that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their age or circumstances, and that sometimes when people forget that lesson, it's up to us to remind them. As I listened to my granddaughter speak those words, I thought about the woman I'd been just 7 years earlier, frightened, dependent, accepting cruelty as the price of not being alone. That woman could never have imagined this moment, this room full of people celebrating not just my birthday, but the work we'd done together to help other women reclaim their own power and dignity. Elena's jewelry collection had given me financial independence, but the real gift had been the permission to value myself enough to demand better treatment. The real transformation hadn't been about money at all. It had been about recognizing that I deserved respect and kindness, not because of what I owned, but because of who I was. As the evening wound down and guests began to say their goodbyes, I found myself standing alone for a moment in front of a display case that held photographs from the jewelry exhibition. There was the Marie Antoinette necklace, the Russian tiara, the Napoleon brooch, all the beautiful pieces that had changed my life simply by existing, by being valuable enough to give me choices I'd never thought possible. But looking at those photographs now, what struck me most wasn't their monetary worth or historical significance. What struck me was the realization that Elena had been right about their true value all along. They weren't just beautiful objects or financial assets. They were stories about women who'd lived and loved and faced challenges across centuries of history. They were reminders that every generation has its struggles, but also its triumphs. And now they were part of my story too, not as an ending, but as a beginning. The beginning of a life lived on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. The beginning of work that mattered, that made a real difference in other people's lives. The beginning of a legacy that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the simple but revolutionary idea that every person, regardless of age, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Standing there in that elegant ballroom, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and conversation from an evening celebrating not just my birthday, but the power of transformation and second chances, I felt Elena's presence once more. And I knew with absolute certainty that she would be proud not just of what I'd done with her gift, but of who I'd become in the process of learning to value myself as much as she had valued those precious, beautiful things she'd entrusted to my care.